imagine a scene. On a seemingly ordinary morning, security officers on routine patrol come across something grotesque and unbelievable. A person with visible vision is evolving a corpse for a morgue. A principle, a macabre act, but within the expected standards. However, the investigation reveals a much more disturbing truth. The undertaker and his assistant were not only preparing the dead for eternal rest, they were renting them. The image is shocking, almost surreal. But what would motivate someone to rent a lifeless body? An answer, even more bizarre, scandalizes the level of desperation to which a nation can reach: gasoline. In the midst of an unprecedented economic crisis, where fuel shortages paralyzed the country, possession of a corpse and a falsified burial order became the key to stealing the kilometer-long lines at gas stations. Disguised as hearse drivers, ordinary citizens exploited a bureaucratic loophole to secure a share of the increasingly scarce supply of gasoline. This macabre practice, this parallel funeral trade, was not an isolated case of eccentricity, but a glaring symptom of an economy on the brink of collapse. A sign that something was terribly wrong. And the setting for this dystopian scenario was Zimbabwe. It is hard to imagine that this nation, once known as the breadbasket of Africa, with a vibrant economy and a promising future, had reached this point. Zimbabwe, with its fertile lands and abundant natural resources, was once a beacon of development and prosperity on the African continent. Its schools were considered the best in the region. Its agriculture not only fed its population, but also exported to neighboring countries. The infrastructure was modern and functional, and the country was an exporter of electricity. However, in a short space of time, this reality collapsed like a house of cards. Shortages, famine, and galloping inflation took hold of the country, transforming Zimbabwe into a tragic example of how economic mismanagement and corruption can lead a nation to ruin. The image of corpses transported by gasoline, as bizarre as it may be, serves as a powerful hook to transport us to this dark story and make us question, how did such a promising country get to this point? The history of Zimbabwe, from Rhodesia to the present day, is marked by a series of interconnected events that culminated in a profound crisis. To understand the scale of the tragedy, it is crucial to trace the main events chronologically, focusing on the human cost at each stage. The seeds of the crisis were planted during the colonial period, with the creation of southern Rhodesia. The white minority held political and economic control, concentrating the best agricultural land in their hands, while the black majority was relegated to less fertile and marginalized areas. This profound inequality in land distribution created lasting resentment and a basis for future conflicts. The human cost here manifested itself in the deprivation of rights, the exploitation of black labor, and the perpetuation of an unjust system. After a long war of liberation, Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, with Robert Mugabe as prime minister. Initially, Mugabe advocated national reconciliation and implemented policies of social inclusion, with investments in education and health. The country experienced a brief period of economic growth and optimism. However, over the years, Mugabe gradually concentrated more power in his hands, undermining democratic institutions and repressing opposition. The initial promise of a prosperous and egalitarian future faded, giving way to authoritarian rule. One of the darkest chapters in Zimbabwe's history was the Gukurahundi massacre of 1983 to 1987. Mugabe deployed an elite military brigade trained by North Korea to suppress political opposition in the Matabeleland region, inhabited mainly by the Ndebele ethnic group. An estimated 20,000 to 80,000 people were killed during this brutal campaign. Gukurahundi was a profound trauma for Zimbabwean society, marking the beginning of a period of political repression and state violence. From the 1990s onwards, Zimbabwe's economy began to decline due to misguided economic policies, corruption, and mismanagement. In 2000, Mugabe implemented a controversial land reform, which expropriated land from white farmers and redistributed it to war veterans and government supporters. The chaotic and violent measure resulted in a drastic drop in agricultural production, affecting the country's food security. The situation was made worse by the uncontrolled printing of money to finance government spending, which led to devastating hyperinflation. In 2008, inflation reached stratospheric levels, estimated at billions of percent per month, rendering the local currency virtually worthless. The hyperinflation and economic crisis led to the collapse of public services. Hospitals ran out of medicines and basic equipment. Schools closed their doors, and the country's infrastructure deteriorated. The population faced shortages of food, clean water, and electricity. Unemployment reached alarming levels, and poverty became widespread. The health system collapsed with outbreaks of diseases such as cholera and HIV/AIDS. Life expectancy in Zimbabwe plummeted, and millions of people were forced to leave the country in search of better living conditions. Cold numbers and statistics rarely convey the true scale of a crisis. To understand the devastating impact of the situation in Zimbabwe, it is essential to look at the stories of the people who lived through it. Giving voice to these human experiences reveals the depth of suffering and the incredible resilience shown in the face of adversity. The chaotic and violent implementation of land reform had dramatic consequences for farmers of all backgrounds. For white farmers, many who had farmed the land for generations and contributed significantly to the country's agricultural production, saw their properties invaded and confiscated. Reports of violence, intimidation, and even murder became common. The loss was not only material, but also emotional and cultural, with entire families uprooted from their homes and a way of life built over decades. The sense of insecurity and loss of confidence in the future was profound. For black farm workers, the situation was devastating. Although agrarian reform was justified as a way to correct historical inequalities in land ownership, many black rural workers lost their jobs and homes on confiscated farms. The promise of land was rarely fulfilled, and many found themselves unemployed, homeless, and without a livelihood. Violence and instability also directly affected their lives, making them indirect victims of the reform. Hyperinflation turned daily life into a nightmare. Product prices rose several times a day, making financial planning impossible. People had to rush to the markets as soon as they received their salaries, fearing that their money would lose its value in a matter of hours. Kilometer-long lines formed in front of stores, and uncertainty about being able to buy basic necessities was constant. Domestic production fell drastically due to the agricultural crisis, and imports became prohibitive due to the devaluation of the currency. Shortages of food and other essential products became widespread, leading many families to hunger. Reports of people scavenging for food in landfills and malnourished children have become a sad reality. The lack of access to nutritious food and basic medicines has had a devastating impact on the health of the population. Diseases that had previously been controlled have spread again, and infant mortality has increased. The already precarious health system has collapsed, with hospitals lacking the resources to meet demand. The brain drain has represented an irreparable loss for Zimbabwe. Doctors, nurses, teachers, engineers, and other skilled professionals have left the country in search of better living and working conditions. This mass migration has resulted in a severe shortage of skilled workers in essential areas, further compromising public services and the country's prospect for recovery. Immigration has also had a severe impact on families, with separation from loved ones and the loss of social ties. Many professionals have been forced to leave their families behind in search of a better future, causing deep emotional distress. The desperation generated by the crisis has led many people to adopt extreme survival strategies. The black market became an important source of supplies, but prices were exorbitant, further exploiting the population. The search for basic products became a daily struggle, with people risking their lives to obtain food and other essential items. The economic crisis also generated a profound moral and social crisis, with an increase in crime, prostitution, and corruption. The anecdote of the corpses rented for gasoline, although shocking, illustrates the extent of desperation and the complete reversal of values that the situation caused. The post-hyperinflation period in Zimbabwe was marked by a series of attempts at stabilization and recovery, interspersed with relapses and new crises. Dollarization in 2009, although it brought immediate relief by controlling galloping inflation, created new challenges. The adoption of foreign currencies solved the problem of hyperinflation, but it also created other problems. The lack of a national currency made it difficult to implement independent monetary policies and made Zimbabwe dependent on the economic policies of other countries, mainly the United States and South Africa. The shortage of dollars in circulation also became a recurring problem, affecting trade and economic activity. The power-sharing agreement between Mugabe and Tsvangirai, known as the Government of National Unity (GNU), brought a period of relative political stability and allowed the implementation of some economic reforms. However, the cohabitation between the two leaders was marked by tensions and power struggles, which limited the effectiveness of the government. Corruption continued to be a serious problem, and the structural reforms needed for economic recovery were not fully implemented. Beginning in 2013, Zimbabwe once again faced a serious economic crisis. The reprinting of local currency, the so-called bond notes, supposedly backed by a loan from an African bank, did not solve the economy's structural problems and ended up generating even more inflation and distrust in the currency. The dollar shortage intensified again, and the economy entered a recession. The fall of Mugabe in 2017 raised expectations of significant changes in the country. However, the government of Emerson Mnangagwa, although it has implemented some reforms, has failed to solve the country's structural economic problems. Inflation remains high, unemployment is at alarming levels, and poverty remains widespread. The lack of investor confidence and persistent corruption continue to hinder the country's economic recovery. Zimbabwe's history offers important lessons about the dangers of unbridled power, corruption, and economic mismanagement. The concentration of power in the hands of a single leader or political party, as seen in Zimbabwe under Mugabe, leads to the erosion of democratic institutions, suppression of civil liberties, and lack of accountability. The absence of checks and balances has allowed abuse of power, corruption, and arbitrary decision-making that have harmed the country. In the case of Zimbabwe, Mugabe's long tenure in power has allowed the creation of a corrupt and clientelist system that has benefited a political elite to the detriment of the majority of the population. Pervasive corruption, present in many sectors of Zimbabwean society, has diverted public resources that should be invested in health, education, infrastructure, and other essential services. Corruption undermines public trust in institutions, weakens the rule of law, and creates an environment conducive to impunity. In Zimbabwe, corruption has contributed to the collapse of public services, increased social inequality, and the deterioration of the population's living conditions. The misguided economic policies implemented in Zimbabwe, such as chaotic land reform, uncontrolled money printing, and excessive government intervention in the economy, created an environment of instability and uncertainty that drove away investors, harmed agricultural and industrial production, and led to hyperinflation. The lack of strategic planning and the absence of effective public policies further aggravated the situation, leading the country to a deep economic and social crisis. In the case of Zimbabwe, the lack of economic diversification, dependence on agriculture, and lack of investment in other productive sectors made the country vulnerable to external shocks and internal crises. The history of Zimbabwe demonstrates the importance of good governance, transparency, accountability, and respect for the rule of law for the economic and social development of a country. Strong and independent institutions, an efficient judicial system, a free press, and an active civil society are essential elements to prevent abuse of power, combat corruption, and ensure the implementation of effective public policies. Zimbabwe's story is not an isolated anomaly. It resonates with other crises that have plagued and continue to plague different parts of the globe. The similarity between Zimbabwe's situation and the Venezuelan crisis, with its episodes of hyperinflation, widespread shortages, and political instability, serves as a grim reminder of how mismanagement, corruption, and institutional weakness can lead a country to ruin. However, the lessons learned from Zimbabwe's experience transcend geographic boundaries and serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and civic engagement in any context. It is crucial to recognize that the problems that have beset Zimbabwe are not unique to developing countries or authoritarian regimes. Concentration of power, corruption, and irresponsible economic policies can arise anywhere, posing a threat to the stability and well-being of nations. The 2008 global financial crisis, for example, demonstrated how a lack of regulation and financial speculation can lead to an economic collapse with consequences on a global scale. Therefore, the story of Zimbabwe calls us to deep reflection and concrete action. We cannot afford complacency or indifference. Apathy and lack of civic engagement pave the way for abuse of power, corruption, and the implementation of policies that harm the majority of the population. With this in mind, it is well known that the first step towards change is knowledge. We must delve deeper into the history of Zimbabwe, seeking to understand the complex causes that led to the crisis. In addition, it is essential to research other economic and political crises around the world, seeking to identify patterns and lessons learned. It is important to seek information from reliable and diverse sources, such as books, academic articles, documentaries, and quality news reports. Public debate and constructive dialogue are essential to building a more informed and engaged society. We should participate in online forums, discussion groups, events, and lectures on topics related to politics, economics, and governance. It is important to listen to different perspectives and build a comprehensive understanding of the challenges we face. Disseminating relevant information is crucial to raising awareness about the importance of civic engagement. We should share relevant information on our social networks, talk to our friends and family, and use different communication channels to reach a wider audience. Raising awareness is the first step towards mobilization and collective action. Supporting civil society organizations that work for transparency, accountability, and economic and social development is essential to strengthening democratic institutions and combating corruption. We should seek out organizations that work in areas such as human rights, combating corruption, education, and community development. Engaging in political life, whether through informed voting, participating in social movements, or following the work of our representatives, is essential to ensure that the interests of the population are represented and that governments are held accountable for their actions. Civic education is essential to educate citizens who are aware of their rights and duties and who are committed to building a more just and democratic society. We must promote civic education in schools, communities, and different spaces of social coexistence. The history of Zimbabwe teaches us that building a better future requires the active engagement of all citizens. By staying informed, engaged, and active, we can contribute to building a more just, prosperous, and democratic world, learning from the mistakes of the past, and building a more promising future for future generations. Apathy is not an option. Action is the key to change.